Hello, everyone, and a big warm welcome to this evening's very special 5x15 online event. This month, we're thrilled to be joined by an incredible lineup as we explore the law, the meaning of freedom, the limits of reason, and gain an unrivaled insight into the events in the Ukraine. A quick housekeeping note this evening, which is sadly that Sam Knight couldn't be with us due to unforeseen circumstances, but he will, we hope, be back in the next couple of months, so watch this space. So tonight it's a 4x15 and it's an incredible lineup. The details are in the chat, and we start this evening with Leah Ypi, who's Professor of Political Theory at the London School of Economics. Her memoir of growing up in communist Albania is called Free, and it's an unforgettable coming-of-age story and exploration of the meaning of freedom in all of its forms. And it was hailed by Phillipe Sands as a lyrical memoir of deep and affecting power of the sweet smell of humanity mingled with flesh, blood, and hope. And it was shortlisted for the 2021 Costa Prize and the 2021 Baille Gifford Prize. So it's a thrill to have you with us, Leah. Thanks for being here all the way from Italy, and over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. So often people, when they ask me about my book, they ask me about the process of writing the book and what brought me to move from my career as an academic to write this very personal literary book. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about the process and how the ideas of the book came out, and then about the main themes. When I think about the process of writing the book, the one sentence that always comes back to my mind is a sentence that says, "I found mommy." And that's because the months of writing Free were months of writing not exactly under conditions of freedom. It began in the spring of 2022, and we had moved to Berlin for a few months, and I spent my mornings locked inside a cupboard. The world was fighting a virus that was still mysterious and very contagious and very unknown. And I was fighting with my children, who were struggling to understand why we should continue to work, given that the schools were closed and everything was locked, and even the playgrounds were shut and everybody was at home. And so I had found shelter in this wardrobe in Berlin, which was quite big, but still designed as a cupboard rather than a study space. And it was the only place where I could take shelter from these three children that were kind of following me around the house, but also turned out to be exactly those conditions of unfreedom, the right place to think about this concept of freedom. I had gone to Berlin a few weeks earlier to wrap up various projects, including a book on Kant's critique of pure reason, very academic, and one on the concept of freedom in the liberal and socialist traditions of thought. And one of the driving ideas of that book was going to be that I had always thought that it was a mistake to oppose liberalism and socialism, interpreting liberalism as a defense, as a set of theories that were committed to defending freedom, and socialism as a question of solidarity or equality. And it had always seemed to me, when I reflected on these concepts theoretically, that both traditions were animated by the same moral question. What kind of moral and political and social order can you justify to people who are subjected to this coercive power of laws, not just the laws of their state of birth, but also the laws of the system of state, the laws of the market, the laws of society? So that initial very academic project was going to show how, for example, some socialist critiques that try to attack the liberal traditions are in fact critiques that expand the concept of freedom rather than reducing it, and engage with this very idea that is central to the liberal tradition, and which make us think about the need to question the foundations of our own society. So that was the academic project, and that was exactly the project that had to be interrupted, because all the libraries were shut suddenly, and all the cancellation of teaching and research activities, but also more generally a state of intellectual and political confusion, which made me very uneasy about the way in which, for example, rights and freedoms that we took for granted, that seemed to be the foundation of the constitutional order of liberal states, like the right to freedom of movement, the freedom of association, or the freedom to be with one's loved ones, all of these were suspended with an appeal to emergency politics. And so it was because of those conditions, because of being in this cupboard in Berlin with my kids around, with the schools shut and the library shut and the research suspended, that I started to think of freedom not as this theoretical, abstract concept, but also as a kind of concrete existential drama, and always the freedom of someone rather than another, the freedom of somewhere rather than another place, and the freedom of a time, but not of another time, which was the COVID case. And so the idea that freedom was always suspended in this condition between, on the one hand, the needs of the individuals, and on the other hand, collective responsibilities, but also more generally suspended between critical thinking on the one hand and ideological capture on the other. And so it was because of this attempt to kind of orient myself in this crisis, which was, as I say, personal, political, and social. And I began to think of these words of my grandmother that came back to my head, who said that when you don't know how to think about the future, what you do is you turn to the past. And that's exactly what I did. I kind of turned to the past and tried to think of, how my own lived experiences could inform thinking about the crisis in which we were living. And so a book that was intended as a book of theoretical and philosophical reflection became a kind of project of recovering the memory of the past and trying to find ways of orienting through those memories in this unease and uncertainty of the present. And so I kind of returned to my childhood and adolescence in Albania, and I thought about the student movement, the demand for freedom in the early 90s in Eastern Europe, the ideological rigidity of socialism, but then also the state of confusion and kind of intellectual abyss in which the transition period threw all of us, and the people that made sacrifices and the lives that were lost and the promises that were realized. And I was wondering, what can we learn from all of this, from this state of crisis that we had gone through once in our history? What could we learn? And suddenly all these kind of abstract concepts that I had thought would orient my project then turned into real characters and became the characters of my book. So the philosophical dilemmas that I was going to describe in this very abstract philosophical way became conversations between people in the flesh. So my father, my mother, my grandmother, my teachers. And so the whole project became then one that turned from a historical and philosophical treatment into this more literary way of exploring the very same ideas, but through lived experiences, because of the lived experience that I myself was going through at that point in writing the book. So the main theme that animates the book is this idea of freedom, and what I try to do in it is to explain what individual agency and responsibility look like when there are larger social constraints and structures of power that inhibit that individual agency. And so the book explores how this concern, this yearning for freedom, is at the heart of all the dilemmas and all the choices that are faced by characters who also have different conceptions of what freedom looks like and how we could realize it, what it takes to realize it, and who encounter these dilemmas as they navigate, as I was doing when I was writing the book, these concerns of crisis and the uncertainty of going and thinking that you were in one system, but that you might suddenly be in another system. And in that case, it was true, they were in one system and then ended up in another system. So the book is set in Albania, which is where I come from, and is in many ways what mathematicians or economists or political scientists call a limit case. A limit case is one where you can test a particular component or a theory or a value in its extreme form. And it's also a limit case because one sees how these ideas of freedom shape lives in different systems, in socialism and in liberalism, and the idea that these two systems are often presented as rivals to each other with a different ethos characterizing each of them. The book tries to challenge that and to talk about how the yearning for freedom is in fact central to the demands of people in both of these systems. And the book is written from the point of view, or ended up being written from the point of view of this young girl who is at the cusp of making a transition from childhood to adulthood, and whose personal, cognitive, and emotional evolution coincides with the evolution, or rather revolution, of her country from one political system to the other. So it's a kind of coming of age story, both for the individual and for the country. And in both cases, it's a relatively traumatic coming of age story. In the personal case, it's traumatic because we learn the ideas of freedom and personal responsibility from our social environment. But in this case, the two main sites of influence, so the family on the one hand and the state on the other, who educate this young girl, are in complete contrast to each other, because I was growing up in this dissident family in Albania without knowing it. And so I was equally subjected to the formative influence of the state, but also of my family. And so I was taught to be a good citizen and a good pioneer, but I didn't know that, for example, my great-grandfather was a fascist who was personally responsible for handing over the sovereignty of Albania to fascist Italian occupiers during the Second World War, or that my grandfather had been a political prisoner for 15 years, or that my mother's family were very large property owners. And so, of course, in every society that is divided by class, whether it's socialism or whether it's liberalism, which class you come from shapes the opportunities that you have in the future, and shapes the sense of self that you develop, and shapes also the sense of future that one has. But in my case, this was extreme because these formative influences were in contrast to each other and pulled in different direction. And that's why it was this tension between these different sides of influence, and the tension between how we think about freedom in these different historical epochs, is in a way what animates the search for freedom in the book and the dialogue that it tries to set up, where there is no unified interpretation of the purposes and of the motives of different characters, but rather an effort to try and show how these different stories shape the self-understanding of someone who grows up in these circumstances. And more generally, all the characters in the book each have a different idea of freedom. So my mother, for example, has what one would call a kind of liberal, classical idea of negative freedom. You're free if nobody stops you from doing certain things, from going somewhere, from associating with someone. My father has a more social idea of freedom, where, you know, philosophers call it positive freedom, whereby you are free only if you have also opportunities to develop yourself. And my grandmother has another idea of freedom, which is the one that I am most philosophically attracted to, which is a kind of freedom as moral agency, whereby we are free to the extent that we choose to make moral decisions while being aware of the constraints around us. And so hers is an idea of moral freedom that then provides the foundation for social critique. And more generally, and really to wrap up, what I wanted to do with this book was, through the story of my family and of my country, to react to what I think has become a very dominant liberal, or maybe even left liberal idea and way of thinking about the end of Cold War, the fate of countries that emerged from the Cold War, and related ideas of the end of history. And I think the dominant tendency has been to think and to relate to the plight of those countries and of those groups who don't share this straightforward liberal trajectory, by thinking of themselves as kind of moral saviors, where, you know, we're ready to free people and to free countries from, you know, their backwardness or their tragedies or their plights, whichever way you want to think about it. And by talking about the multiplicity of ideas of freedom in my country, in a limit case like Albania, in a limit case like my family in Albania, I wanted to highlight the risk of paternalism that there is in interpreting these stories that come from these contexts in a very homogeneous way, and in the risk of paternalism that there is, which ends up, I think, perpetuating the oppression rather than liberating people, when it attributes to context different from the liberal one this sense of need and victimhood. And so Albania was kind of extreme in its heroic rejection of imported models in the form of Soviet socialism, and also extreme then afterwards in the post-1990 period in its commitment to Western liberal values. And my grandmother was also in some ways extreme in saying that, you know, we always have this fundamental moral freedom. But I thought that it was really important to tell this story of this context, of this country, of these people, from a perspective that saw and that made people and readers aware of the fact that this is not just a history of tragedy and oppression, but it's also freedom where people exercise their agency. And so it's one of continuous liberation from within, both individual and collective. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Leah, thank you so much. That was such a brilliant beginning to our evening and such a tour de force. Thank you so, so much. Free is out now and it's extremely timely and thought-provoking. So next up, we have Luke Harding. He is one of our favorite 5x15 speakers, and he's joining us again to discuss the Ukraine, Russia, Putin, and what happens next. Luke is an award-winning foreign correspondent. He was with The Guardian. He's a #1 best-selling New York Times best-selling author. And between 2007 and 2011, he was The Guardian's Moscow bureau chief. The Kremlin expelled him from the country in the first case of its kind since the Cold War. He's the author of Collusion, A Very Expensive Poison, The Snowden Files, and Mafia State, as well as the co-author of WikiLeaks and The Liar, which was nominated for the Orwell Prize. It's a thrill to have you with us, Luke. Thanks for finding time. I know you're incredibly busy. And over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Daisy. Hello, 5x15 audience. Yeah, I mean, it's quite an interesting time to kind of reflect on my writing and work, I guess, over more than a decade, because I've long believed, I mean, as Daisy said, I was the Moscow bureau chief between 2007 and 2011, that the regime of Vladimir Putin, now in power for more than 20 years, was not only domestically repressive, which we saw in the treatment of the Russian opposition, of human rights activists, of journalists, but it was also internationally dangerous and revisionist. And we've really had plenty of warning of what was going to happen in Ukraine. There have been multiple dark episodes, you might say, leading up to it, including, for example, the teapot murder in 2006 of Alexander Litvinenko in London with polonium, about which I wrote a book, A Very Expensive Poison. And also, when I was in Moscow, the war in Georgia in 2008, where Russian troops kind of overrolled Georgia in what now looks like a sort of dress rehearsal for the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And of course, the kind of full-blown invasion that we saw on February the 24th. And so I've been charting that, and I've also been trying to chart, especially in Shadow State, my most recent book, the sort of what you might call hybrid war, Russian hybrid war, and the attempt by the Putin regime to subvert and undermine Western democracies and our political processes. And the two biggest examples of those, both from 2016, were the covert support, sweeping and systematic, as Robert Mueller put it, for Donald Trump in America, and of course the kind of under the table push that the Russians gave Brexit, a story that both Boris Johnson and Theresa May were extremely reluctant to investigate. So basically, we had warning. We had warning of the nature of this regime. We had warning of the way Putin sees the world and exists in a parallel reality. And I was always convinced, actually, from, I would say, the autumn of last year, that we were moving towards some kind of crisis/invasion in Ukraine. And the context is that Putin had spent 2 years extremely isolated. I mean, he's really reduced to spending time with a very small group of like-minded, ultra hawkish advisors. And what he produced in the pandemic was an essay published last summer on the Kremlin's website with a rather curious title. I think it was, The Historical Unity of Russia and Ukraine, where essentially he argued that Russia and Ukraine were one people and that Ukraine did not exist. This has long been his view, that it's a kind of sub-sovereign, not country, occupying lands which are what Putin called historical Russia. Now, I've read this. You don't need to read it, but I mean, there are two kind of clear takeaways which I think pointed us towards the war in Ukraine. One is this rather astonishing critique of Lenin, whose waxy body sits in Red Square in its mausoleum just around the corner from Vladimir Putin's office. Putin basically blames Lenin for creating modern Ukraine in 1924 and making it a socialist republic, and says that the communists were responsible for this fiction. And the other thing which made me think, look, he's really going to do it, was that Putin was essentially channeling in this essay classic Russian imperial thinking from the 19th century. It's almost as if he's playing at being Nicholas I, or Peter the Great, or Catherine the Great, and that Putin had convinced himself, possibly at a time when he's ill, we don't know, there's lots of speculation about his health, convinced himself that he had this sort of great, almost messianic religious task to unite Ukraine, unite the sort of lost brethren, Orthodox brethren of Ukraine with Great Russia. And so I started going to Ukraine I mean, I've been there on and off for 15 years, but I made a trip, I made a film in December of last year. I went to the front line with just outside Donetsk, which has been held by Russian-backed separatists since 2014. I got shot at by a Russian sniper and went around these kind of First World War trenches where Ukrainian soldiers were facing off against their Russian adversaries. And then I went back in late January of this year, and I went to Mariupol, which is this port city on the Sea of Azov, vibrant, Ukrainian-controlled, European, with artists, with entrepreneurs, with great parks. And everyone I spoke to in Kiev said that the Mariupol would be the first target. And so I made another film, again on the front line with separatists. And there's one scene I keep thinking about. I can't get it out of my head, which was that on my last night there, in what turned out to be about 3 weeks before the invasion, I went to I had a restaurant in a kind of cellar tavern, and it was one of those sort of classic party scenes where the men were sitting very awkwardly, around a table, and the women were all kind of dancing with each other and having a great time. And when I look back at that scene, I mean, we now know between 15 and 20,000 people have been killed in Mariupol by Russian bombs and missiles and shelling and grads. And I just, almost like something out of a medieval woodcut, I see this figure of death kind of almost among the dancers, pulling them by the sleeve, because Mariupol is gone. I mean, it's just disappeared. It's been effaced from the map. And so I kept going to Kiev amid alarming briefings from the US and actually the UK intelligence community, who got the war in Iraq wrong, but who were saying pretty loudly in February that Vladimir Putin was going to invade. I mean, how he was going to do it, we didn't know. And then on February the 23rd, I had dinner with Andrei Kurkov, fabulous, wonderful Ukrainian novelist, a friend of mine. By the way, I can recommend his book, his most recent book, Grey Bees, set in the gray zone between separatist and Ukraine. And we were having dinner, and I had a call basically from a Ukrainian contact saying the invasion will happen at 4 a.m. And so, we made grim jokes, went back to my hotel, and about half an hour later than scheduled, we hear the first explosions. And somehow, there is a gap between knowing something, probably will happen from an analytical perspective, and the horror of war engulfing everything. And for me, it became real a couple of hours later, where I was sitting in the bomb shelter with plenty of other journalists, and this Ukrainian family wandered in. It was 6 a.m. from the street, and these little bleary-eyed kids sat on 2 big hotel chairs, and they were sort of doing their coloring books. And I just thought, actually, I tweeted about it, but I just thought, actually, that this war is not a story of high politics. I mean, it is. It's not a story about international relations. It's not a story about the madness of one man. Preeminently, it's a story about civilians, about families, about separation, about shelling, about death, or about maiming. It's a human tragedy. It's the biggest war on the European continent for 80 years. And what was also clear was it was one of what you might call, there was a kind of unambiguous moral clarity about it, because Ukraine, which since I've been going there has been moving inexorably in a kind of pro-Western, democratic European direction. There was an attempt, really a colonial attempt, a blatant colonial attempt to conquer it, to subjugate it, to bring it back into this neo-Soviet sphere of control and lugubrious domination. And what's also fascinating is the way in which this invasion has, I would say, semi-failed. I mean, the Russians have conquered a huge amount of territory in the south and east of Ukraine. Mariupol, the city I visited in January, has fallen. The last defenders have gone out into captivity and torture. But there's been this astonishing fight back by the Ukrainians. And what strikes me is just how Putin has fallen victim to his own kind of mythic thinking. I mean, he believes Russian state propaganda says that Ukraine is run by Nazis, and he thought that the people living in Ukraine would sort of genuinely rise up and welcome liberation. And of course, the opposite has happened. There's been this brave, astonishing, horizontally organized, patriotic uprising where, small example, there was this wonderful stamp released by the Ukrainian post office of this famous warship, the Moskva, which the Ukrainians had just sunk with two missiles with a soldier. It was a symbol of defiance. Ukrainian soldier doing, Russian warship, go fuck yourself, sign. And there were 7-hour queues outside the post office to get this stamp. I mean, Ukraine is not Russia, contrary to what Putin says. And we now see in the east of the country, in the Donbass, which Putin says he wants to conquer, we see a heroic attempt to hang on to territory and to fight back. And meanwhile, on my last trip, I'm going back to Ukraine in a couple of days for another kind of reporting assignment, but I did a couple of extraordinary trips to the areas which were occupied by Russian soldiers for over a month, to Bucha, to Gostomel, to Irpin, to Borodyanka, also up to Chernobyl.
Luke?
And it was just a hellscape of blown out Russian tanks with Zs, but also actually with Vs and Os. In the north, they were marked with Vs and Os. A story of imperial hubris, but also of astonishing sort of cruelty and barbarism. Basically, what happened in was that the Russians swept in and they carried out what was called a zachistka, which is a sweep operation. And they went from house to house. And I keep thinking about this. I told the story of one 26-year-old guy, and I'll name him. It's important to name people. He's called Volodymyr Chernyshenko. And he had taken photos of a wiped out column, Russian armored column in Bucha, sent them to a girl he knew. And these Russian soldiers knocked on the door and they confiscated his phone. And they found the images and they said to him, Ty idешь с nami, using the informal T form in Russian. They said, you're coming with us. And they took him to a kind of house down the road. His aunt, who told me the story, shinned up an apple tree and watched him being interrogated. They'd broken his arm. He was all bloody. He was crying. He was sobbing. And they were saying, where are the Nazis? Where are the Nazis? He was saying, I don't know where the Nazis are. I don't know anything. And they took him away. And they told his mother that he would be returned after the war and that everything would be well. And then eventually they chaotically retreated in this kind of Mad Max convoy when Putin decided to give up his attempts to capture Kiev. And they found his body just around the corner, about 150 meters away, in a cellar. I went into it. And there was a bloodstained mattress. There was a smell of death, which I knew from previous reporting stints. And he was buried in a shallow grave. There are shallow graves all over Ukraine. I got a list today of Mariupol. 1,164 people buried in improvised graves. There are in Bucha and elsewhere, there are numerous stories of execution of people being kept and killed. It is. I've done the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've been in Syria. I've been in Georgia. I've done a lot of conflict reporting. This is the worst I've seen. And I would just say, by way of closing, that I mean, this war has shaken up our international politics. It has it is that, I mean, it was Lenin who said there are decades where nothing happens and there are weeks where everything happens. These have been weeks in which everything has happened. I mean, the Germans have abandoned pacifism. The Swedes and the Finns are joining NATO. The UK has shed some of its sort of post-Brexit estrangement from its continental neighbors. The US has found a role under Joe Biden, is providing $48 billion in equipment and aid, which may yet turn the war in Ukraine's favor, to this beleaguered country of 45 million people. But we have a situation of a grinding war where this massive lethal force unleashed by Russia may yet prevail, as it did in the Second World War, at huge costs in terms of men and material, as it did in the Finnish War, and this kind of mighty bear may tear more chunks out of Ukraine. We just have to wait and see. But it's the most important foreign story of our times. It's the biggest human tragedy. It's the largest refugee crisis since the Second World War. And I'm just grateful to you, 5x15 viewers, for your support, for your passion, and for your interest in it. Keep up. It's going to be a long conflict. And Slava Ukraine.
Luke, thank you so much for being with us. That was such a sobering and insightful talk about human tragedy and the cost of the war. And we're so grateful to you for all that you do in bringing these stories to us and your firsthand accounts. Thank you very much for being with us, and we will see you again soon. Thank you. So next up, we have a special guest, the Secret Barrister, a junior barrister specializing in criminal law and an anonymous author. So their first book won a number of awards and was in the bestsellers for more than a year. And their second book, Fake Law, was also an instant bestseller. And they've now returned with Nothing But the Truth, in which the Secret Barrister reveals their own personal story, charting the journey to the bar and lifting the lid on life inside the Inns of Court. So tonight, as the Secret Barrister is anonymous, the Secret Barrister will be performed by Kirsty Mann, who's an actress, and we're very thrilled to have her with us. So over to you. And
good evening. Thank you very much for having me. For those of you who haven't heard of me, I'm the Secret Barrister. I'm a criminal barrister and author who has, for the past few years, clogged up Twitter, blogs, newspaper columns, and a couple of books with my thoughts on the justice system. I started blogging in 2015 about the things I witnessed each day prosecuting and defending in the criminal courts, because I could not quite believe the disconnect that had been allowed to grow between the justice system and the people who own it. Every day, I was seeing an underfunded, breaking criminal justice system, routinely failing the people who depend on it. But whenever I spoke to anybody outside the legal profession, they were completely unaware of that reality. I'd grown sick and tired of having to tell witnesses and victims of crime that, once again, the courts did not have space to hold the trial that they had waited 2 years for, and that they would be required to attend again in a year's time. I was fed up of seeing human beings at the most vulnerable points in their lives being treated as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet, their suffering of no interest to our lawmakers, as long as the public were kept in the dark about what was happening to their justice system. And as I began to write, I started to become quite evangelical about breaking down this barrier. People deserve to know the truth about their justice system. They deserve to know where the real problems lie so that they can hold their democratically elected politicians to account. They also deserve to know when they're being lied to, when somebody in power is trying to mislead the public about what the problems actually are. Too often, we've seen politicians and the media exploit the public's lack of familiarity with the justice system to peddle lies that serve the agenda of the powerful. Lies that distract from the true issues in the justice system, lies which have, on occasion, convinced citizens not only to agree with, but to actively campaign for the removal of their own rights. This knowledge gap is something that I set out to try and address in my first two books, called Stories of the Law and How It's Broken and Fake Law. I wanted to show people the stories that weren't making the headlines and to help counter some of the misinformation that we're fed. But with my third book, Nothing But the Truth, I want to try something a little different. One of the stark dividing lines that I noticed before I became a lawyer, and which has been confirmed over my decade of practice, is between what lawyers think about justice and what it means to the general public. In particular, questions such as whether our criminal justice system is too soft on criminals, whether there are too many convicted people avoiding prison, whether we need more bobbies on the beat and longer sentences for those found guilty. There tends to be a bright divide in attitudes, and I am in the, I think, somewhat unusual position of having crossed that divide, because before I became a criminal barrister, my views on criminal justice were much more aligned with what polls suggested the majority views of the public. I thought we had a system that cared too much about criminals and not enough about victims. Judges who stuck two fingers up at the notion of personal responsibility, and a legal aid system which threw bucket loads of taxpayers' cash at lawyers to game the system in service of dangerous foreign offenders. But the things I saw and heard on my way to becoming a criminal barrister changed me, virtually beyond recognition. There was no Damascene moment, no single client or case that sent scales falling from my eyes, nothing of that sort. But somewhere in my own messy conversion lies, I think, some of the answers as to why we have this apparent gulf in values between the system and the public. And the one thing of which I'm truly certain is that I was wrong to ever be certain. Justice is too complex for that. So what I'm going to talk about now are some extracts from the new book. It charts my progress from angry law student some time ago now to marginally less angry practicing criminal barrister. And I hope it at least sparks some questions, even if, as I've admitted, I can't really promise any answers. You might think that having spent at least 4 years studying and accruing debts up to £100,000, and after squeezing into the 2% of law graduates who nail down a pupillage, you'd have earned a measure of job security. Alas, pupillage is but the eliminator in the spandexless version of gladiators that passes for barristerial qualification. For the next 12 months, you are the subject of a 24/7 job interview in which not just a panel, but all of your prospective colleagues will be scrutinizing your every move before voting on whether you should be offered tenancy, a permanent position as a self-employed member of chambers. Some pupillages, mainly outside London, are rewarded with a view to tenancy, meaning that as long as you demonstrate a base level of competence and avoid disgracing yourself in a social media or sex scandal, you are likely to be okay. But many chambers recruit several pupils, intending to offer at most one tenancy, pitting contestants against each other in a brown-nosing race to the bottom, which we prefer to think of as a virtuous meritocracy. Pupillage is split into a first 6 and a second 6. For the first 6 months, you shadow your allocated pupil supervisor or supervisors, learning by watching them in court, carrying out research, drafting documents. You subsist on your pupillage award paid by chambers. In my day, that was £1,000 a month. Your second 6 is when you're on your feet. You're technically employed in your own right, appearing in court by yourself and doing and billing your own cases, albeit under the supposedly watchful eye of your supervisor. The headline is that around a third of pupils don't receive tenancy offers at the end of the year, leaving them either scrambling for the life raft of a third 6 pupillage, that is another 6 months of learning on the job, or bidding adieu to their abortive career at the independent bar. My immersion into this lobster pot coincided roughly with the start of the reduction in public spending that followed the 2008 global financial crash. There'd been a long-running battle between the bar and the Labour government over fee reductions and the structure of the criminal legal profession, although my understanding of the detail was at this point limited. But having voted Conservative for most of my enfranchised life and being sympathetic to the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government, I did not need much persuading of the need to tighten belts and rein in spending. Moreover, I thought justice's purest expression was punishment, and I was looking forward to the professional challenge of both defending and prosecuting the bad bastards with Swiss neutrality, still wholly unburdened by any deeper sense of mission. And of course, and I cannot overstate the importance of this, I was looking forward to the rich seam of fascinating, gory anecdotes primed to be mined should I ever be invited to a dinner party. My pupil supervisor for the year was Alan. Directness was very much Alan's hallmark. There was no malice. He simply considered life too short for niceties. Does being ugly make this job harder? He once asked a male opponent in court. It wasn't intended as cruel. He was just genuinely curious. Alan's skin was rhinocerine, an evolutionary product of having been a working class man at the bar in an era when such social status was not only vanishingly rare, but rendered him fair game for overt snobbery and mockery among practitioners and judges alike on account of his accent, his appearance, and his lack of approved legal breeding. Not having a blood relative sitting at the High Court was even more of a hindrance to career advancements in the 1980s and 90s than it is today. And no doubt there was a greasy streak of jealousy among the landed gentry that Alan had forced his way into the profession without the leg up on which so many of them had relied. One of Alan's greatest pearls of wisdom formed part of a motivational introduction. You are the least important person in this building. Remember that. You are the last person the clerks want to have to think about, and the last person whose opinion matters. Keep that in mind, and you won't go far wrong. It's a popular misconception that the job of a defense barrister is to dream up preposterous defenses for admittedly guilty clients. Your overriding duty as a barrister, the closest we have to a Hippocratic oath, is not to mislead the court. So if a defendant tells you that he's guilty, you cannot positively assert the opposite. If you have a client who, having admitted his guilt to you, insists that he still wants to run a trial, then you can continue to represent him, but you're extremely limited in what you can say to a jury. You can put the prosecution to proof, pointing out the holes or inconsistencies and reminding the jury that they must be sure of guilt before they can convict. But you can't positively suggest that your client is not guilty. It's exceedingly rare. This all means that, far from my own teenage understanding of the role of a defense lawyer, much of your time is spent advising clients on the strength of the case against them and of the merits of pleading guilty. And again, not what I expected from TV. It transpires that many defendants will willingly and sensibly throw in their hand when they receive the benefit of robust legal advice. My first day in court as a pupil was as terrifying as any day I've gone on to have in practice. And the closer I watched and listened to my colleagues to be in action, the greater swelled the feeling of dread. Fluent eloquence under pressure is one of those, how hard can it be, skills that looks eminently replicable until you attempt it yourself, like hooking a plastic duck at a carnival or digging a shallow grave. The confident poise with which the advocates make their submissions, sparring with not an or in sight, gracefully leaping into the air like loquacious fish to catch judicial barbs in their mouths and politely spit them back out again. These are things that the version of me in my head was a natural at, but as I learned, the real version is not. The idea that I would be able to slot into this tableau in 26 weeks would have been laughable were it not spectacularly, deathly unfunny. And it isn't just the verbal dexterity, it's the language. The idiosyncratic mode of courtroom address, which you were summarily trained for at bar school, but which bears little resemblance to match day, all the "may it please your honours" and "in my respectful submissions" and "my learned friends," combined with the indecipherable choreography of barristers seemingly standing and sitting back down again at random, renders a court hearing at best alienating, At worst, completely impossible for anybody not versed in bar lingo to follow what the hell is going on. Throw in the shorthand, the industry acronyms, the in-jokes, the very particular style of wry humor that is permissible, but only with certain judges and only if you have the experience to pull it off. And you have a spectacle which all the actors understand, but which is wholly incomprehensible to the audience, like performing Brecht to a room full of Dachshunds. And this is a problem. It's something which you quickly forget once you're doing it, but courts are by their very nature public forums for the administration of justice. What we do matters to society at large, not just the lawyers in the case. It's essential that somebody stepping into the public gallery, and not least the person in the dock whose fate is being discussed, can understand what is being played out before them. As criminal advocates, we are mostly aware of this when addressing juries or advising clients, when we cleanse our speech of jargon and reach for hammy pop culture references to clumsily illustrate our points. But when it's just advocates and the judge talking, it can quickly revert to a lawyer's private affair, where the lights metaphorically dim and we only have eyes for each other. At such times, a member of the public watching from beyond the perimeter, whether a curious stranger or the defendant in the dock whose liberty is being deliberated by wigged heads speaking in foreign tongues, must find it hard to feel much kinship with our justice system. That feeling of otherness, which I know that most of us feel when starting out, is one which I think we would probably do well to remember, instead of, as I know I was guilty of early on, striving to join the natives in their impenetrable legal culture and leaving the public behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the Secret Barrister for that incredible talk. Nothing but the truth is out now. So now to our final speaker this evening, we have William Atkins, an acclaimed travel writer whose books have been shortlisted for the Wainwright Prize, and he's won the Stanford Dolman Travel Writing Award and the British Library Eccles Prize. He recently guest edited a special travel writing edition of Granta, and we were thrilled to collaborate with him and with Granta on a very special 5x15 around that. His third book is called Exiles, and it has just come out. It's a masterpiece of storytelling, travel writing, and imaginative empathy. And it's a book about displacement, colonialism, and what it means to have a home. So welcome, Will, and thank you very much for being with us.
Daisy, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here in such wonderful company. Thanks for having me, and thanks to our viewers for tuning in. I'd like to talk to you tonight about a remote island, about a political exile, and the journey I made in his footsteps. It's a story about 19th century Russia, which is also, of course, a story about modern Russia. Last month, the Kremlin published an order to relocate about 100,000 captured Ukrainian civilians from Mariupol and elsewhere to various remote regions of Russia. And among the places listed was the island of Sakhalin. Now, details were lacking then, as they are now, but for anyone familiar with the name Sakhalin and familiar with its history, then the suggestion was chilling. And I'd like to try and explain why. Sakhalin, which I visited almost exactly 3 years ago to the day, while I was researching my book about 3 late 19th century political exiles and their places of exile, is Russia's largest island. It just lies a few miles off the Siberian mainland, about 4,000 miles from Moscow. When Anton Chekhov visited in 1890, it was already synonymous as a penal colony with the worst brutalities of Imperial Russia. And Chekhov had decided to make this long journey, this 4,000-mile journey overland from Moscow in order to write a kind of expose, a journalistic expose, not something we associate with Chekhov. Sakhalin Island, as the book was titled, is a pretty unremittingly horrifying account of squalor, sexual abuse, systemic cruelty and ineptitude, and state murder. And it was quite a cause célèbre when it was published in Russia a few years later. It wasn't Chekhov, however, who prompted me to make the journey to Sakhalin. 2 years before the great writer arrived on the island, another young man found himself on Sakhalin, and not willingly. The late 19th century, of course, was a period of great political tumult, political violence in Russia as it was in Europe. And among those who were radically opposed to the Tsarist regime in Russia was a young Jewish Ukrainian man named Lev Sternberg. And Lev grew up in the currently besieged city of Zhytomyr in northern Ukraine. And Daisy, if we can have the picture of Lev, that would be great. This is Lev Sternberg as a young man, shortly after the events that transformed Russia and transformed his life, in fact. And as a teenager, Lev joined the violent anti-Tsarist organization known as the People's Will. In 1888, just after the People's Will assassinated the Tsar Alexander II in St. Petersburg, Lev, along with most of his colleagues of the People's Will, although he played actually no part in the assassination, was arrested and imprisoned. And he was imprisoned in Odessa, and he stayed there in the grimmest of solitary confinement for about 3 years, until finally, without the inconvenience or publicity of a trial, Lev was exiled, and exiled not to Siberia, as many of his comrades were, but to somewhere even further away, as far as it was possible to get within the Russian Empire, to the island of Sakhalin. So although Siberia had been a place of banishment for Russia since the 1600s, in the late 19th century, the number of criminals and political exiles being sent to its penal labor sites had become unsustainable. By 1876, about 20,000 convicts were arriving in Siberia each year, and they were dying of exposure, they were dying of malnutrition and disease, escapes were soaring, crime was soaring, and there was not enough work to occupy them all. So Sakhalin, this large, sparsely populated, coal-rich island off the far east coast of far eastern Russia, promised three things: to relieve the pressure on Siberia, firstly, and then to supply the Russian industrial system with fuel, with coal, and then, as importantly as either of those, to consolidate the frontier with nearby Japan, which lies just a few miles south of Sakhalin and which has historically contested the island's sovereignty and indeed still does. Perhaps we can have the map of Sakhalin, please, Daisy. So you can see, I hope, from this map that Sakhalin is a long, thin island, and it's more than 30,000 square miles, about 600 miles long, nearly as big as Austria, in fact. And by the time Chekhov and Sternberg arrived, it was already a byword, in Russia at least, for bleakness and isolation and hardship. It was, as one commentator put it, the final destination of the unshot and the unhanged. So I arrived in Russia on the 9th of May, 3 years ago, Victory Day, as you may know, when Russia marks its victory over Nazi Germany. And I traveled across Siberia, and I arrived by train at the Tatar Strait port of Vanino, from where I took a rusting Soviet-era ferry overnight to Sakhalin. So in 1889, Lev Sternberg was sent to Sakhalin's then capital, Alexandrovsk, on the northwestern coast of the island, and I followed him there. And Russian has a useful word for travelers, and I hope any Russian speakers, including Luke, will forgive my pronunciation. The word is rasputitsa, time without roads, and it refers to spring when the snows melt and autumn when the rain comes. And in northern Sakhalin in May, I found it was wise to travel any distance by train. As a political prisoner, Lev was spared hard labor, but he soon became a thorn in the side of the prison camp authorities, because he vocally objected to the mistreatment of non-political prisoners and wrote anonymous letters to various newspapers doing the same. And eventually the directors of the penal colony grew tired of the troublesome Sternberg, not least because they were worried about him blabbing to this man, Anton Chekhov, who they'd heard was on his way to the island to write about it. So Lev was banished. He was exiled within exile to a tiny military checkpoint 50 miles north of Alexandrovsk, this bleak headland on the Tartar Strait, a place known as Viak 2. And if we can have the third slide of Viak 2, please, Daisy. Here's Viak 2, a pretty bad quality image taken around 1890 when Lev was living there. So he spent almost 2 years in this place with just a handful of soldiers for company and a convicted wife murderer as his neighbor. But it was here too that Sternberg experienced what he called his ethnographic baptism, because it was at Viak 2 that he got to know the Nivka people, and eventually undertook, despite having no formal training at all, some of the first detailed ethnographic field studies of any of Russia's indigenous people. Very briefly, the Nivki are one of 5 indigenous peoples of Eastern Siberia, known by ethnographers as Paleo-Asiatics, and their language has no known connection with other linguistic groups. They were traditionally semi-nomadic fishers with an animist belief system. So Viak 2, Lev Sternberg's exile within exile, became my objective. And if we can have the 4th slide, this shows the disused port at Alexandrovsk. This is the place where Chekhov arrived on Sakhalin and the place where Sternberg arrived on Sakhalin. And in Alexandrovsk, which is now really an obsolete port, I befriended the director of the regional museum, Mr. Miramanov. He was the former mayor of the town. He was I was told, darling of the town's amateur dramatic society. And he was very, very interested in knowing what a lone Englishman was doing in northern Sakhalin. Nevertheless, he agreed to take me to Viak 2 in exchange for petrol and vodka, assuming the roads were passable. So we set off one morning, driving on these flooded dirt tracks over rickety bridges across rivers in spate, until after about 4 or 5 hours, we arrive at the edge of the estuary of the Viak 2 river. And on a beach, we found a fisherman named Obbit, and Obbit rather bewilderedly agreed to take us across the estuary to whatever was left of Viak 2. And then after what was probably the most terrifying boat voyage of my life, only half an hour or so, we arrived soaked through. We reached this place I'd imagined for so long. And what did we find? Well, as my friend, Mr. Miramanov, the museum manager, put it well, nothing, Will. There's nothing here. And if we can have the last slide of Viak 2, please, Daisy, showing Viak 2 in 2019. And as you can see, Mr. Miramanov had a point. There was very little left of the place Sternberg had known, just a few timbers, the footings of ruined walls. Sternberg wrote, "The gloomy sky hung low over the savannah, bordered by a thick fog, and beyond it, apparently, was the end of the world. Nakrai Sveta, the end of the world." And it still felt like the end of the world. And yet to be there meant something. By looking out on the sea Lev had known, on the forest and the mountains, on the fog, on the estuary, I felt I was somehow able to understand him as I could not have understood him had I stayed at home. So Lev Sternberg was not in the end to die on Sakhalin, as so many of his friends did. He was finally allowed to return to St. Petersburg 8 years later, where he went on to have an extraordinarily influential career as an ethnographer, as a teacher, as the founder of St. Petersburg's world-famous Institute of Anthropology. In fact, you could say that as a result of his exile, Lev Sternberg invented the discipline of ethnography in Russia, or at least contributed to it. So in some ways, exile made him. But the reports of the revival of Sakhalin I mentioned at the beginning as a place of displacement, of deportation, and the more than 7 million people, I think it's nearly 8 million people now displaced by the war in Ukraine, are reminders that displacement is not always temporary and is very rarely productive, as it was for Sternberg. And exile I saw on Sakhalin begets exile. Today, most of Sakhalin's 2,000 Nivk people live in and around the oil towns of the northeast, having been ejected over the past century from their traditional fishing settlements, first by Russian colonists of the late 19th century, then by a succession of Soviet attempts to remove them from their territory, and then by really the mass murder of Nivki men under Stalin in the 40s. The Nivki of Sternberg's time believes that the god of thunder lived beneath the Tatar Strait, which is the strait that separates the island from the mainland of Russia. So it came as no surprise to them when a tunnel connecting the two, ordered by Stalin in 1950 as a symbol of Russian unity, as well as a military asset, collapsed during construction, drowning hundreds of forced laborers, including many conscripted Nivki. And it should perhaps come as no surprise to us that Putin has commissioned designs for a bridge at the same spot, inspired apparently by the one he built between Crimea and Russia after the annexation of Crimea in 2014.
Thank you, Will. Thank you so much for being with us and for your extraordinary story and extraordinary storytelling, beautifully illustrated. Exiles is out now, and it couldn't be more timely or more important. So it's been an incredible evening, and we were thrilled at 5x15 to have hosted these writers and speakers and journalists this evening. So thank you so much to Will, to Luke, to Leah, and to the Secret Barrister, to talk about displacement, about Russia and the Ukraine, about freedom, our rights, and the law. It's been incredibly thought-provoking, and we thought that there were hundreds of people signed up this evening. Please don't forget to buy the books, and that we will be back next month with Jeff Dyer, Layla Motley, Jonathan Friedland, and Jackie Morris. So don't miss it. But for this evening, thank you all, and good night.